In 1985, the Soviet Union appeared to be a giant made of steel. To anyone looking from the outside, it was a terrifying superpower. It had tens of thousands of nuclear missiles, the largest army in the world, and a history of winning great wars. When the Soviet leaders stood on top of the Kremlin during military parades, they looked like they were in total control of the world. But inside the halls of government, a small group of men knew a secret that they were terrified to share with the public. The Soviet Union was not strong. It was actually dying. It wasn't being destroyed by a foreign army or a secret plot by the United States. It was dying because of a slow-acting poison that had gotten into every part of society. The Soviet Union was drunk, and it was about to have the worst economic hangover in human history. To understand this disaster, we have to look at how people lived back then. Alcoholism in the Soviet Union was not just a small problem, and by the early 1980s, it had become a national emergency. The KGB, which was the secret police, kept track of how much people were drinking, and the numbers were shocking. They were so bad that the government made them top secret. While people in other countries were living longer lives thanks to better medicine, people in the Soviet Union were dying younger. In just 20 years, the average life for a Soviet man dropped from 67 years old down to only 62. In some poor areas, it was even lower. Men were literally drinking themselves to death before they could even stop working and retire. This drinking was killing the economy. The Soviet system was already slow and messy, but alcoholism made it stop working entirely. People would show up to work drunk, or they wouldn't show up at all. This happened so much on Mondays that factory managers just expected it. When people are drunk, they make mistakes. Expensive machines that the government had bought from other countries were constantly breaking because the people using them were intoxicated. On farms, tractors were left to rust in the fields because the drivers were too drunk to finish the harvest. It was estimated that this cost the country tens of billions of rubles every single year. But here was the trap. Even though alcohol was destroying the workers, it was the only thing keeping the government's bank account full. For a long time, the Soviet government was the only one allowed to make and sell vodka. It was very cheap to make. You just needed grain, potatoes, and water. But the government sold it for a very high price. It was a huge source of easy money. In a country where you couldn't find good shoes or even toilet paper in the stores, you could always find vodka. It was the one thing that always worked. By 1984, the money from selling vodka made up about 20% of the entire government's budget. The leaders were stuck in a cycle. They needed their people to be sober so they could work, but they needed them to stay drunk so the government didn't go broke. For years, the old leaders of the Soviet Union chose to ignore the problem. They were addicted to that easy vodka money. But in March 1985, a new leader named Mikhail Gorbachev took over. He was only 54 years old, which was young for a Soviet leader. He was energetic, and he truly believed in the communist system. He thought the Soviet Union could be great again if they just fixed the corruption and the laziness. When he looked at his country, the first thing he saw was the bottle. He saw a nation of people who were too drunk to build the future he wanted. He felt it was his moral duty to stop the drinking. He decided his first big move as leader would be a war on vodka. Gorbachev didn't ask for advice from economists. He didn't ask the finance department what would happen if the government stopped making money from vodka. He was a man in a hurry, and he used his power to smash the drinking culture with a sledgehammer. In May 1985, he started a massive campaign to stop the nation from drinking. He ordered the factories to stop making so much vodka. He closed thousands of liquor stores. He changed the rules so that stores could only open for a few hours in the afternoon. He even raised the price of vodka so high that poor people couldn't afford it. But then he went even further. He ordered the destruction of vineyards across the country. In places like Georgia and Moldova, where people had been making famous wine for hundreds of years, the government sent in bulldozers. They ripped out the grapevines and flattened the fields. Farmers watched in tears as their family history was destroyed in a single day. The government even censored movies. If an old movie showed a character having a drink, that scene was cut out. On TV, they showed actors drinking juice and mineral water, pretending that everyone was happy and sober. For a few months, it looked like it was working. People were showing up to work a bit more, and there were fewer accidents. Gorbachev was happy, but he made a huge mistake that many leaders make. He thought that if he took away the supply of something, people would stop wanting it. He forgot that the Soviet people were experts at surviving hard times. They didn't stop wanting to drink, they just stopped buying their drinks from the government. Almost overnight, the entire country turned into a nation of illegal bootleggers. If the government wouldn't sell them vodka, they would make it themselves. This homemade alcohol was called samogon. You could make it in a bathtub, a kitchen, or a shed. All you needed was sugar. Suddenly, a strange thing happened. While the government stores were empty of vodka, the grocery stores ran out of sugar. People weren't buying sugar to bake cakes. They were buying 100-pound sacks of it to turn into alcohol. The government was caught totally off guard. They hadn't planned for a sugar shortage. Soon, the government had to start rationing sugar. You needed a special coupon just to buy a bag of it. But the thirsty citizens didn't stop there. When the sugar ran out, they used whatever they could find. They used candy, tomato paste, and even cheap perfume or window cleaner. Some people even tried to strain alcohol out of shoe polish. Because this homemade stuff was often toxic, people started getting poisoned. The health benefits of the war on vodka vanished because people were now drinking poison instead of regulated alcohol. While the people were busy making moonshine, the government's bank account was bleeding to death. The loss of the vodka money tore a giant hole in the budget. Gorbachev had effectively fired his own biggest moneymaker. He lost about 100 billion rubles, which was almost as much as the entire military budget. At the same time, the second big source of money for the Soviet Union collapsed. For years, the country had survived by selling oil to other nations. But in 1986, the price of oil crashed from $30 a barrel to just $10. This was the perfect storm. In 1 year, the Soviet Union lost its money from vodka and its money from oil. It was like a person losing their job and their side business at the same time, but still having to pay a giant mortgage. The government's income was cut in half, but they still had thousands of missiles to maintain and millions of soldiers to pay. They also had to buy grain from the United States because their own farms were failing. Without oil money, they couldn't afford to buy food. Instead of admitting he was wrong, Gorbachev tried to keep going. He turned on the printing presses and started making more and more rubles. But printing money doesn't create wealth. Since there were no goods in the stores, the money became worthless. This led to the famous shortage economy. People had pockets full of cash, but the shelves were empty. If you saw a line of people on the street, you joined it immediately without even asking what they were selling. It might be shoes, it might be sausages, or it might be light bulbs. You bought whatever was at the front of the line because it was the only thing you could do with your money. In this world, the ruble lost its value. People went back to trading things instead of using cash. This is called a barter economy, and what do you think became the most valuable thing to trade? It was the very thing Gorbachev tried to ban: vodka. A bottle of vodka became more valuable than a stack of rubles. You paid your doctor with vodka. You tipped your taxi driver with vodka. You used vodka to bribe people to get things done. The government had lost control of its money, and the liquid currency had taken over. Inside the Kremlin, the situation was turning into a panic. Gorbachev and his team realized they were running out of cash to pay for the military or to buy food. They began to borrow huge amounts of money from banks in Western Europe. They used the country's gold reserves as a guarantee that they would pay it back. But they weren't using the borrowed money to build new businesses. They were using it just to buy food so people wouldn't starve. They were borrowing money just to stay alive for one more month. By 1987, the excitement about Gorbachev's new plans had turned into anger. The people had been promised a better life, but instead, they got empty stores and no sugar. In 1988, the government finally gave up and ended the war on vodka. They tried to open the liquor stores again to get the money back, but it was too late. The system was already broken. The vineyards were gone, the state factories were a mess, and the black market was now run by powerful gangsters. The money that used to go to the government was now going to the Russian mafia. Gorbachev had tried to do something good, but he accidentally broke the most important part of his own economy. By 1989, the Soviet Union was like a company that was totally bankrupt, but still trying to act like it was the boss. The 15 different areas that made up the Soviet Union, like Ukraine and the Baltics, started to rebel. They saw that the central government in Moscow was broke. They decided to stop sending their tax money to Moscow. They said, "Our people are hungry. Why should we give our money to you?" This was a tax strike on a massive scale. Boris Yeltsin, the leader of Russia, told the regions to keep their money and ignore Gorbachev. Gorbachev was still the president, and he still had the nuclear codes, but he had no money. He was like a king without a treasure chest. He had to go to his old enemies in the West and beg for loans just to buy bread. In 1990, things got so bad that even basic things like cigarettes and soap disappeared from the stores. In a country of heavy smokers, having no cigarettes led to riots in the streets. People were overturning buses because they couldn't get a smoke. The superpower was now asking other countries for care packages of powdered milk and canned meat. In January 1991, the government made one last desperate attempt to save the money system. They came up with a plan called the Pavlov Reform. One night on the news, they announced that all 50 and 100 ruble bills were no longer worth anything. These were the large bills that people used for their life savings. The government gave people only 3 days to exchange their old bills for new ones, and they put a very low limit on how much you could keep. This was basically the government stealing the people's savings. Imagine being an elderly woman who had saved money under her mattress for 30 years for her funeral. Suddenly, the government tells you that your money is just worthless paper unless you can get to a bank and wait in a giant line in the freezing cold. This move destroyed any remaining trust the people had in the government. People realized the state was a predator, not a protector. Even after this, the inflation didn't stop. The government just kept printing more and more money to pay its bills. By the summer of 1991, the end was near. The Soviet Union's gold reserves were almost gone. In 1985, they had 20,100 tons of gold. By 1991, they had less than 240 tons left. They had sold all their gold just to keep the lights on. In August, a group of hardline leaders in the army and the KGB tried to take over the government to restore order. They put Gorbachev under house arrest and put tanks in the streets of Moscow. But they failed. They failed because they had no plan to fix the economy. You can't use a tank to pay a debt. The plotters realized that even if they won, they would be in charge of a country with $0 in the bank. The coup fell apart in 3 days. When Gorbachev came back, he was a leader with no power. The 15 republics finally decided to leave and become independent countries. On December 25th, 1991, the Soviet flag was taken down for the last time. The empire was gone. It didn't end because it was defeated in a war. It ended because it was bankrupt. It had spent decades lying about its strength while the people were drinking themselves to death, and the government was wasting all its money. The 1990s were very hard for the people who lived through them. Because the Soviet Union had wasted all its wealth, the new countries were left with nothing. Prices went up by 2,500% in 1 year. People who had saved for a car could now only afford a loaf of bread. But this pain wasn't caused by the new democracy. It was the final bill coming due for the mistakes of the past. It was the withdrawal symptoms of a nation that had been addicted to oil and vodka money for too long. The story of the Soviet Union is a lesson for every nation. It shows that being a superpower isn't just about having the most missiles or the biggest parades. It's about having a healthy economy and people who can trust their money. Gorbachev had good intentions. He wanted to help his people. But he tried to fix the symptoms of the problem, the drinking, without fixing the real disease, which was a broken economic system. By attacking the vodka money, he kicked away the only thing holding up the building. In the end, the alcohol won. The Russian government never got back its monopoly on vodka. People kept drinking to forget the pain of the economic collapse, and the mafia got rich off the trade. The Soviet Union didn't die because of a bang. It died because it tried to sober up, and the shock was too much for its system to handle. It is a reminder that in the world of history and economics, if you don't check your bank balance, even a great empire can disappear into the night. The empire drowned in red ink, and the bottle of vodka was the last thing left standing. The legacy of this event still shapes the world today. It shows how quickly a giant can fall when it relies on just one or two things for its money. Whether it is oil in the ground or a tax on a bottle, easy money is never as good as real productivity. When the Soviet people finally stood up and demanded change, they weren't just asking for freedom. They were asking for a store that had bread and a government that wouldn't steal their savings. The bankruptcy of 1991 was the end of a long, dark story, and it took decades for the region to finally find its way back to stability. Russia didn't even finish paying off the old Soviet debts until 2017. That is how long a hangover from a bankrupt superpower can last. As we look back, we see that the fall of the hammer and sickle was inevitable. You can't run a world-class empire on a third-class economy. No matter how many nuclear bombs you have, if you can't pay for the grain to feed your citizens, the system will eventually fail. The war on vodka was the final mistake that proved the Soviet Union was living on borrowed time. It was a moral crusade that ended in a financial funeral. And so, the Great Soviet Experiment ended not with a victory for the West, but with a silent signing of a resignation paper in an empty office, while a hungry nation looked for its next meal. The story of the Soviet Union is more than just a history lesson. It is a warning about what happens when a country stops producing things of value and starts living off luck. In the 1970s, the Soviets thought they were geniuses because oil was expensive. In the 1980s, they thought they were moral leaders because they tried to stop drinking. But in both cases, they weren't looking at the math. Economics is like gravity. You might not like it, but it still controls everything. When the Soviet leaders finally realized they were broke, they also realized they were no longer a superpower. This history also shows us the human side of big political changes. We talk about empires and superpowers, but behind those words are millions of ordinary people. These were people who stood in line for hours for a piece of meat, people who lost their life savings in 3 days, and people who watched their culture being torn apart. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a tragedy for many, even if it brought freedom to others. It was a time of fear and confusion. Today, we still see the effects of these events in the way countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia behave. They remember the empty stores and the worthless money. They know that stability is fragile. They know that a government can be very powerful one day and gone the next. The greatest bankruptcy in history changed the map of the world forever. But it started with something as small as a bottle of vodka and a falling price of oil. In the end, the lesson is simple. True strength comes from the ground up, not from the top down. A nation is only as strong as its people's ability to work, create, and trust each other. When a government treats its people like a cash cow and its economy like a lottery, it is only a matter of time before the money runs out. And when the money runs out, the flags come down. The Soviet Union OS story is a reminder that no nation is too big to fail. Even the mightiest giants can fall if they lose their footing in the mud of a bad economy. I'm John, and this has been a look at the cinematic history of the fall of the Soviet Union. This story reminds us that history isn't just made of wars and treaties. It's made of bank ledgers and daily bread. If you want to understand the world, don't just look at the maps. Look at the money. Subscribe now to keep learning the secrets of how the world truly works.